Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. Just a reminder at the beginning of this episode, if you would like to send me a voice message or an email, check out the link in the show notes in the bio and let me know if you have a suggestion for a podcast episode, if you have a question that you've been wondering about. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, go ahead and click subscribe or follow so that you can get updates whenever new episodes release. In today's episode, I want to talk about a pattern that I see over and over again in my work with couples. It's something that often confuses partners and creates a lot of hurt in relationships. A partner will say something like, sometimes he can be so open and easy to talk to. We have real conversations. We laugh together. It feels like we're finally connecting. And then something emotional happens. Maybe she brings something up that he said that hurt her. Maybe he's stressed about work. Maybe she's processing something painful. And suddenly he disappears. He shuts down. He becomes defensive, critical, distant, sometimes angry. And what makes the pattern so confusing is that she has already seen that he can connect. So the question becomes, if he can do it sometimes, why can't he do it consistently? Over the years, I've come to understand that in many of these situations, the issue isn't love or commitment. The issue is emotional capacity. Many men were never taught how to develop emotional regulation or emotional presence. Instead, they learned something very different, and that is how to manage tasks, how to solve problems, and how to perform in the world. But relationships require a different kind of competence. They require emotional competence. And when someone hasn't developed that competence yet, the relationship often begins operating under a hidden rule. Often neither person is aware of or can state, but it sounds something like things work in our relationship as long as emotions stay manageable. But life and relationships don't stay emotionally manageable all the time. Real intimacy includes grief, disappointment, sorrow, stress, anger, and vulnerability. And when someone doesn't yet have the internal capacity to stay present with those emotions, we start to see patterns emerge that I call emotional cycling. But before we talk about emotional cycling, I want to tell you about a client I worked with years ago. So, years ago, I had a male client that I had been working with for a while, and he came into session complaining about his wife. He was frustrated because she talked to her best friend on the phone a lot, usually during the day while the kids were at school and he was at work. But recently, it had also started happening in the evenings. And it wasn't the first time he had complained about this or talked to me about this. So the kids would go to bed and she would call her friend. He said it annoyed him. He thought it was excessive. He felt like she was spending too much time talking to her friend. So I asked him what he was doing during that same time in the evening. And he said he was usually playing video games. I remember saying something that he did not expect. I said, her best friend might actually be a saving grace for your marriage. And he looked at me completely confused. I explained something to him that I see all the time. For many women, close friendships become places where they process emotions. They talk through experiences. They make sense of things that they're feeling or that are confusing or painful. They regulate their nervous system through connection. In other words, they practice emotional processing. And that emotional processing helps them show up more grounded in their relationships. But often for men, they grow up without those kinds of emotional spaces. They aren't talking to their friends about vulnerability or confusion or relational hurt. Their friendships often revolve around activities rather than conversations. So while he was criticizing his wife for talking to her best friend, what he was actually criticizing was something he himself had never learned to do. That friend wasn't damaging the marriage. In many ways, she was supporting it and propping it up because emotional processing has to happen somewhere. And when it can't happen inside the relationship, women will find other places where it can happen safely. That conversation has stayed with me for years because I think it illustrates something important. Many women receive thousands of hours of informal emotional education through their friendships. Many men receive almost none. And that gap shows up in relationships. When that gap exists, couples often experience what I call emotional cycling. Emotional cycling is when someone can access connection and openness for periods of time, but they can't sustain it when emotional intensity increases, even in small amounts. So the relationship moves through cycles of connection and shutdown. Things feel calm and connected for a while. Conversations are easier. The relationship feels lighter. There's more physical affection, laughter, and a sense of closeness. And the partner often thinks, we're finally getting somewhere. But then something emotional happens. Maybe stress increases or vulnerability appears. And suddenly the nervous system becomes overwhelmed. When emotional intensity exceeds someone's capacity, the system moves into protection. Protection may look like defensiveness, criticism, minimizing, raging, or emotional withdrawal. And for the partner who just experienced connection a few days or weeks earlier, this shift can feel incredibly confusing and sudden. What she's actually seeing is emotional capacity that is real, but not yet stable. Emotional cycling isn't about whether someone cares. It's about whether their emotional system can hold the intensity of the moment. And to understand why that happens, we have to look at how emotional development often unfolds differently for men and women. A big contributor to emotional cycling is childhood emotional environments, something that often doesn't get talked about. Many people grew up in families where emotions were not handled well. Emotions were ignored. Maybe they were shamed for having them. They might have been explosive. And children adapt to those environments by developing strategies that help them survive. They may suppress their own emotions. They may try to manage the emotions of their parents, or they may focus on achievement. They often can become highly logical, and these strategies work very well in childhood, but they create problems in adult relationships. Imagine a brother and sister growing up in the same family where emotions are not handled well. Neither child receives good emotional guidance, but society is going to respond to each of them very differently. The daughter receives messages that emotions are normal. She processes experience through friendships. She talks about them and she practices emotional language from the time she's very young. The son will receive a different message from society. He learns that men don't have emotions or that showing them makes him weak. And his friends have received the same message. So that message will be reinforced. By adulthood, the sister may have had thousands of hours practicing emotional awareness, where the brother may have had almost none. When someone hasn't developed internal emotional regulation skills, they often borrow regulation from their partner. Their nervous system stays steady as long as the environment stays emotionally manageable. When emotions become intense, the system becomes overwhelmed. So the person tries to restore emotional equilibrium. That may sound like you're overreacting, you need to calm down, let's not make this a big deal. And that's the relationship operating under this hidden rule. I can stay regulated and connected as long as you stay emotionally manageable. But intimacy requires something different. It requires the capacity to show up and stay present even when emotions are uncomfortable. Another way to understand this dynamic is what I call the competence gap. Most men grow up as boys being trained for competence in the external world. They learn how to solve problems, how to achieve, how to perform under pressure, how to provide financially. And for many men, the message about their role in relationships is very clear. Your job is to provide. Historically, that has always meant providing financially. But providing financially and partnering emotionally are two very different skill sets. Providing focuses on solving problems and producing outcomes. Partnership, though, requires something different. It requires the ability to sit with experiences that cannot just be solved. Experiences like grief, disappointment, fear, and vulnerability. And for many men, those experiences feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory where they have no competence, which leads to avoidance. I have a male client that I work with, and I've worked with him for years. He told me something several years ago that has stuck with me. This couple originally came into therapy. There were some ongoing issues in their relationship. There had been infidelity. And his wife had identified something she felt was missing. She said, There is not a lot of emotional depth between us. She didn't feel like they were really connecting. And early in the process, he had said something very directly to me in an individual session. He said, I'm not going to do that feeling shit. That was pretty close to his exact wording. And he genuinely felt like his wife wanted him to become a completely different person than who he was. From his perspective, she was asking him to do something unnatural. He and I had many conversations about this over time, both in couple sessions and in individual sessions. And one of the things that stood out to me was something he would tell me every few months. About every 4 or 5 months, he would say something like this: I feel lonely. He would say he felt lonely in his relationship and he felt lonely in his life in general. He didn't have a lot of friends. He didn't have deep connections with his kids. And every time he would tell me that, we would return to the same conversation. I would tell him that the thing he was trying to avoid was actually the thing that creates connection. Emotions are what bring warmth into relationship. They're what creates closeness. They're what allows people to feel seen and understood. Without emotional expression, relationships often become functional, even transactional. People can live together, raise children, share responsibilities, but the deeper sense of connection is missing. And as I had told him many, many times, I suspect that had been missing his whole life. And that was the loneliness that he was feeling. At the same time, he was the client who once said to me, Jackie, I'd rather vacuum the whole house every day than sit down and have an emotional conversation with my wife. That's the statement that stayed with me for years. And when he said it, he was serious. And I knew he was serious. His statement also captures something important. Vacuuming the house is a task. He can be competent there. You know what to do. You know when you've completed it. You know when you've done it well. But emotional conversations can feel confusing, unpredictable, and overwhelming for someone who was never taught how to navigate them. So when men feel out of their depth emotionally, they often move toward what they do know how to do. They do things, they fix things, they complete tasks. And those things can be absolutely helpful. But being helpful is not the same thing as being emotionally partnered. You can support a household with tasks and still feel deeply lonely inside the relationship. And that was the paradox he was living in. He was trying to avoid emotions because they felt uncomfortable. But the thing he was avoiding was also the thing that creates the connection he said he wanted. I'm also thinking of a couple I work with. Their kids are grown, they have young grandkids. They came to therapy because of his rage toward his wife. He told me he grew up in a family of high achievers. He said, I grew up in a family of all golden children. Performance and success were valued in his family. And in the outside world, he is incredibly competent. But in his relationship, he rages because emotional vulnerability activates shame. He doesn't know how to do it. He tries to avoid it. And rage becomes the defense to that shame. Partners will often ask, why do I get the worst of him when everyone else gets the best? And the answer is intimate relationships can create emotional exposure. Work relationships don't do that. The closer the relationship, the more emotionally exposed a person becomes. And exposure activates defenses and protection. Often, his shutdown happens even when the emotions have nothing to do with the relationship. She might simply say, "Oh man, it's been a hard day." And the response may be to minimize or avoid that conversation because his nervous system is reacting to emotional intensity itself. I see another version of this dynamic in addiction recovery. Men early in recovery have to learn how to manage triggers, and often they learn to avoid triggers in order to move past the trigger without relapse. And that's important. But what gets bypassed is the emotions underneath the trigger. And in their wife, they often mistake her emotional processing for her not avoiding the trigger. When the partner is expressing hurt or grief, it may be interpreted as something that needs to be shut down. He might get mad at her that she didn't avoid the trigger, she actually opened it up. But processing emotions is not the same thing as being triggered. And while avoiding triggers can stabilize behavior, healing requires understanding what lives underneath those triggers. And recovery isn't just avoiding triggers, it is learning to process emotions. It's learning the internal landscape. Yes, managing triggers stops behavior, but processing emotions heals relationships. Over time, partners often begin adjusting their emotions to keep the relationship stable. They soften their feelings. They delay or avoid conversations. They're constantly trying to regulate themselves. And they become the emotional regulator for the entire relationship and maybe even the entire house. And that can feel lonely. Another piece of this dynamic that I think it's important to talk about is emotional labor. In many relationships, emotional labor often falls more heavily on women. Emotional labor is the work of noticing emotions, managing them, talking about them, and helping relationships stay connected. It's the work of paying attention to how people are feeling. It's the work of initiating conversations when something feels off, when the kids seem like they need emotional support, or when extended family dynamics need attention. It's also the work of repairing conflict. And she often becomes the emotional manager for all of that. Meanwhile, the husband often feels like he's doing his part because he's solving problems, he's working hard and providing stability. So both people can feel like they're contributing, but they're contributing in very different currencies. And often our society only recognizes one of those currencies, the one that men provide. And that difference often reflects how boys and girls were socialized growing up. Girls are socialized to maintain relationships, while boys are socialized to perform competence. And when one partner hasn't developed a lot of emotional capacity yet, that work often will get carried almost entirely by the other partner. And over time, that becomes exhausting because relationships require emotional participation from both people, not just one. When emotional labor falls mostly on one partner, the relationship starts to feel unbalanced. Not because the other person isn't contributing in other ways. He is working hard, he's providing financially, doing practical things to support the family. But emotional partnership requires something different. It requires both people being able to show up emotionally. Will they do that differently? Absolutely. But both people need to be willing to sit with difficult feelings and take responsibility for the emotional health of the relationship. When emotional labor is shared, relationships tend to feel more balanced and connected. When it isn't shared, one partner often begins to feel lonely, even when they're still together. When someone is borrowing emotional regulation from their partner, emotional labor almost always automatically shifts onto that partner. Because the person borrowing regulation needs the other person to stay steady, which means one nervous system is carrying the emotional stability for two people. And that's a heavy load to carry for a long period of time. One place that I see emotional capacity grow for men is in group therapy. I love running and developing groups, watching men begin talking about their childhoods, what happened that shouldn't have, what didn't happen that should have. And they start connecting those experiences to their relationships. Often, when those conversations happen about the cultural messes, I will talk with the group about the cultural messages boys receive starting very early in childhood. Boys are often told, directly or indirectly, that men don't have emotions. That's not cool. Or that having emotions makes them weak. Or that showing vulnerability makes them girly. And those messages start early. What boys are rarely told is the long-term cost of that messaging. They're not told that emotional suppression often leads to depression or anxiety or loneliness or emptiness. They're not told that when emotional pain doesn't have healthy outlets, it can show up as anger or violence. They're not told that emotional isolation is one of the factors connected to male suicide. Those outcomes that we have plenty of research on are never part of the message when the emotional rules are being taught. But they are often part of the outcome later in life. When men begin to see that pattern clearly, they often feel something they didn't expect. They feel anger. Anger that they were given emotional rules that made their lives harder. Anger that they were never taught skills they actually needed for relationships. And when that moment happens in group, I will say something like, if I were you, that realization would make me angry too. Because anger in that moment isn't something to shut down. It's appropriate anger. It's often the first step toward recognizing that something important was missing. And that recognition can become the beginning of emotional growth. As group members continue sharing their experiences, they begin practicing something many of them have never practiced before. They learn how to stay present while someone else is expressing emotions. They learn how to name their own internal experiences. They learn that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to humiliation or rejection. Over time, their emotional vocabulary begins to expand, and they begin regulating their emotions in the presence of other people, which is exactly the skill that intimate relationships require. In many ways, group therapy creates something similar to the emotional processing spaces women often develop through their close friendships. Women frequently talk through experiences with friends. They process emotions together. They help each other make sense of confusing or painful situations. And men haven't had those spaces. Group therapy creates one. And when men begin practicing emotional and presence in those environments, their capacity inside their relationships begins to grow. When I talk about group therapy for men and friendships for women, or even group therapy for women, I'm not suggesting they look the same. They almost always look different. The rhythm of the conversation is different. The way vulnerability emerges can be different. But those differences aren't problems. One is not doing it better than the other. They're simply different expressions of the same human process. People learning how to share experiences and support each other emotionally. The goal is not for men to connect like women. The goal is for men to connect in ways that are authentic and emotionally present. Because emotional connection doesn't have to look the same for everyone to be real. Emotional maturity doesn't appear overnight. It develops through repeated experiences of noticing emotions, naming emotions, tolerating emotional discomfort, taking up space, and staying present with another person's experience. Those are skills, and like any skills, they improve with practice. Something I often tell men in group is this: you don't have to know exactly what to say when someone is emotional. You just have to be willing to stay present and feel in your body, because presence is what creates connection. Not fixing, not solving, just being present. Over time, as these men continue to show up for group, something else begins to happen. They start walking through life together. And I don't mean that casually. I've watched groups of men sit with each other through some of the most significant moments in their lives. They've supported each other through the death of a parent. They've talked openly about abusive parents and the impact those childhood experiences still have on them. They've processed the fear and joy that comes with the birth of a child. They've sat with each other through unemployment and financial insecurity and the uncertainty both of those things bring. They've helped each other through relapse and the shame that often follows it. Some have walked through divorce together. They talk about what it's like to start dating again after a long marriage. And I've watched men strengthen their marriages by practicing emotional presence and accountability with each other first in group. What makes those experiences powerful is that the men aren't just hearing advice. They're witnessing each other's lives. They're witnessing grief, fear, responsibility, growth, and resilience. They're seeing other men navigate emotional experiences without shutting down or running away. And every time that happens, their understanding of what it means to be a man updates and expands a little bit more. Over time, these experiences begin to challenge the old emotional rules many of them learned growing up. The rule that men should handle everything on their own. The rule that vulnerability is weakness. The rule that emotional pain should be hidden. Instead, they begin experiencing something different. They experience support. They experience empathy and belonging. And many of them begin realizing that emotional connection between men isn't something to fear. It's actually something that strengthens them. As they begin sharing more openly, they start forming real emotional bonds with each other. They hear each other's story. They witness each other's pain. They watch each other struggle and grow. And sometimes a man will share something deeply vulnerable. Maybe he talks about pain from childhood he has never spoken out loud before. The other men in the group feel that. They witness his pain. They feel it with him. And after he finishes, another man in the group might say something simple but powerful. He might lean forward and look at them and say, I love you. And at first, the man who shared brushes it aside. He's in a little bit of a vulnerability hangover. And he'll say, thanks. But then the other man might respond and say, no, I want you to actually hear me. I love you and I care about you. And those moments are incredibly powerful. Because for many men, that may be the first time another man has expressed care for them in that way. Not through humor, not through teasing, and not through shared activities, but through direct emotional language. And when that happens, you see something shift in the room. Men start realizing that emotional connection between men is not weakness. It's strength, it's support, it's belonging. They witness each other's lives, and emotional capacity grows through that witnessing. When men begin learning these skills in community, they become more capable of bringing that emotional presence into their relationships. Because the same skills that allow a man to sit with another man's grief or vulnerability are the very same skills that allow him to sit with his partner's emotions. And that's where emotional capacity begins to grow. Not through avoiding emotions, not by suppressing them, but through learning that emotions can be experienced and shared without shame. When men begin experiencing real emotional support from other men, it changes what they believe is possible in relationships. And emotional capacity grows when people learn they don't have to carry their experiences alone. Now, as I step back and look at all of these pieces together, something over the years has become very clear to me. Human beings learn emotional skills in relationship. Women often learn them through close friendships. I also talk to a lot of women who don't have close friends and even have some pain and trauma around friendships. So we also run groups for women. And through conversations, they start to grow because they're processing what they're feeling and what they're going through. Men often haven't had those same spaces growing up, which is why it's so beneficial for men to enter environments like group therapy, where something important begins to happen. They begin practicing emotional presence with other men. They begin naming emotions they've never said out loud before. And they begin to sit with each other and get comfortable through grief, fear, sorrow, shame, and vulnerability. Emotional connection isn't something we can figure out alone. It's something we have to learn through practice with other people. And when emotional capacity begins to grow, whether through friendships, therapy, or other supportive relationships, the patterns I talked about earlier, like emotional cycling, begin to change. Many men were raised in environments where emotional development simply wasn't part of their training. They were taught instead how to perform, how to succeed, and how to solve problems, how to provide financially. But they were rarely taught how to sit with emotions, how to tolerate vulnerability, and how to stay present when someone they love is hurting. So when emotions show up in relationships, many men will feel like suddenly they're in unfamiliar territory, and that does not feel safe. When people feel out of their depth, the nervous system will move into protection. And from the partner's perspective, that can feel incredibly painful because she knows her partner is capable of being present. She has seen his kindness, his competence, his genuineness, and his ability to show up in other areas of his life. So when emotional presence disappears in the relationship, it feels confusing and lonely. What we're seeing in those moments isn't a lack of love. It's a lack of emotional capacity that was never fully developed. And I do think that's an important distinction because emotional capacity isn't fixed. It's not set in stone. It can grow. And I see that growth happen all the time. I see it when men begin talking about experiences they've never shared before, when they start connecting dots between their childhood and their present relationships, when they learn that emotions don't have to be hidden or avoided, when they discover that vulnerability doesn't always lead to shame. Sometimes it actually leads to connection, to understanding, and to healing. The men that I see in group therapy are learning that emotional strength doesn't come from suppressing emotions. It comes from learning how to experience them without being overwhelmed. And when that capacity grows, something else begins to change. The emotional cycling begins to slow down. Connection and presence becomes more stable. Conversations that once felt impossible become manageable. And relationships begin to feel less lonely for both partners. Because partnership requires something that older models of relationships didn't require. They require emotional presence from both people. Not perfection, not always knowing the right thing to say, just the willingness to stay present when emotions show up. Willingness to sit with another person's experience. And a willingness to grow in places that may never have been developed before. As I've said, many men were never taught those skills growing up, but they can absolutely learn them. And when they do, relationships change in powerful ways. Because real intimacy doesn't happen when emotions are avoided. It happens when two people are willing to face them together. Intimacy begins when emotional presence replaces emotional avoidance. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.